Have you ever heard of Groundhog Day? A harmless tradition, a folk festival where a groundhog supposedly predicts the length of winter. An event for tourists to laugh, take pictures, and go home with cheap souvenirs. But there's something no one tells you. Something buried beneath generations of manipulated stories. What would happen if the groundhog saw something that wasn't supposed to be there? What would happen if, instead of predicting the weather, it was trying to warn us about something much, much worse? I never believed in superstitions. Until that night. Until I witnessed what happened in Punxsutawney. No one talks about the strange things surrounding this tradition. About the disappearances. About the unexplained electrical failures. About the fact that in certain years, the groundhog simply vanishes, and no one seems to care. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And now, I think something is watching me. The question is this just a myth, or a secret ritual disguised as a celebration? I never believed in superstitions. My grandmother used to say that ancient traditions always carry a grain of truth, but I used to laugh at that. Until that night. Until that February 2nd, when everything changed. Groundhog Day had always been a harmless festivity, a silly folklore meant to entertain tourists and children. But there's something no one tells you. Something buried beneath generations of laughter and fantasy. What happens when the groundhog sees its shadow and doesn't go back to its burrow? What happens when winter isn't just a season, but a warning? The town of Punxsutawney looks harmless at first glance. Small houses, quiet streets, and a cold that cuts to the bone. I always found it strange how such an absurd tradition could capture the attention of so many people. A groundhog comes out of its hole, looks at the sky, and decides the fate of winter? Ridiculous. Or at least, that's what I thought. When I went to cover the event for a small news blog, I expected to find nothing but a cheerful crowd, laughter, and vendors selling cheap souvenirs. But something felt off that night. The cold was different. Heavy. As if the air itself was soaked in something unseen. The older residents acted strangely, whispering among themselves, avoiding direct eye contact with the groundhog's burrow. And when Phil emerged, something happened. Something I was never supposed to witness. The crowd cheered, but silence followed immediately after. Phil didn't move. His eyes were wide, frozen on something that no one else could see. He saw his shadow, but he didn't run back to his burrow. He just stood there, trembling, his tiny paws scratching at the ground. A man in a dark overcoat, someone I hadn't noticed before, slowly approached the stage. He wasn't part of the organization. His eyes were sunken, as if he hadn't blinked in centuries. That was the moment I realized, this wasn't just a guessing game. It wasn't just folklore. What that groundhog saw was not its shadow. I should have left right then. Something inside me was screaming to run, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I stayed. Not out of curiosity, but because leaving felt impossible. The spectators remained frozen, as if some invisible force was holding them in place. The man in the overcoat took another step forward. He didn't seem to care about the nervous glances around him. His hands were covered in worn-out gloves, but I could still notice the strange elongated shape of his fingers. He leaned slightly toward the groundhog, as if whispering something. And then, Phil began to make a sound that groundhogs shouldn't be able to make. It was a hiss. Not an animal squeak, not a growl. It was as if something inside him was twisting, a voice being forced out of a body that couldn't contain it. The few townspeople still present turned their faces away, some clutching small charms in their pockets. I tried to move, but my muscles were too stiff. Phil wasn't moving anymore, his eyes locked on the man, or perhaps on something behind him. And then the lights went out. The stage, once illuminated by bright spotlights, was swallowed in darkness, broken only by the faint glow of cell phones. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something rotten. The feeling that something was about to emerge from the shadows became unbearable. Then, I heard a whisper. Not near me, but inside my own head. He saw. Now, all of you will see. When the lights flickered back on, the man in the overcoat was gone. And so was Phil. The pedestal where the groundhog was supposed to be stood empty. But something was still there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman in the crowd screamed. A scream of pure terror, not the kind that comes from surprise, but one that rises from the depths of the soul. The once frozen crowd began to run. I tried to understand what they were seeing, but something stopped me. My mind refused to process it. All I know is, I didn't run fast enough. Acquiesco tragiceo do scu texto para ingles, mantendo o tom narrativo e involvent para narraceo. I don't remember exactly how I got out of there. My memory fragments after that moment. I remember the panicked crowd, the pale faces, the air thick with a smell I've never been able to forget, like old wet wood, mixed with something sweet and rotting. When I came to my senses, I was already a few blocks away, leaning against a brick wall, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind was scrambling for a logical explanation. But that was the problem. None of it made sense. Groundhog Day had always been treated as a harmless joke, a folklore with no scientific basis. Phil's weather predictions were always questionable, with only a 35% accuracy rate. But what if that statistic was wrong? What if the tradition wasn't about predicting the weather, but about warning us about something only a few could see? I had to understand. I had to know exactly what that groundhog saw before it vanished. I did what any journalist would do. I started researching. But the deeper I dug, the more unsettled I became. I discovered that Phil wasn't the only groundhog used for weather predictions. There were others, like Staten Island Chuck, who had a much higher accuracy rate, 85%. But what if that didn't mean Chuck was better at predicting the weather? What if it meant that he never saw what Phil saw? What disturbed me most was that, in the years when Phil got it wrong, the winters were strangely harsher. And there was something else. Something no one talked about. At least 4 times in the past 50 years, Phil had disappeared. The newspapers never reported it directly. There was always an explanation. He was resting or had been taken for veterinary checkups. But there were never any records. Never any photos. And there was another pattern. Every time this happened, people disappeared from the town. Elderly locals with no close family. Lonely tourists. Always near the event. Always leaving no trace. And always, with no proper investigation. That's when I realized. The mistake was never the groundhog's. The mistake was ours. We never understood what we were measuring. This tradition was never just a game. I knew that now, but I still didn't know what it truly meant. Groundhog Day seemed harmless, a celebration passed down through centuries, brought from Europe by German immigrants. But the more I read, the more the story started to warp, like a reflection in a broken mirror. People talked about Candlemas, about the custom of watching animals to predict the weather. But no one talked about the disappearances. No one talked about what really happened when winter didn't end. I found old records, documents that shouldn't have been so easy to access. Punxsutawney wasn't always known for Groundhog Day. Before that, there were whispered stories about the beast of winter, something that lurked in the forests, something that should never be seen. The early settlers spoke of rituals to keep it away, offerings left in the woods. But at some point, everything changed. The ritual was disguised as a festival. And the groundhog, well, the groundhog became the substitute. The oldest texts I found mentioned that in some cultures, animals were used as witnesses in occult ceremonies. They were forced to look at something humans should never see. If the animal fled, it meant it was still there. If it stayed, it meant the threat had passed. Or worse. The date of the celebration wasn't a coincidence. February 2nd marked a point between the solstice and the equinox, a time when the veil between worlds thinned. But no one talked about that anymore. No one remembered. Or maybe, they just pretended not to know. I went back through the missing persons reports. The dates always matched. When Phil saw his shadow, someone vanished. As if he was warning us. Trying to tell us. Trying to stop it. But the year I was there, he didn't run. He stood there, trembling, staring at something no one else could see. What did that mean? My research was starting to affect me. I barely slept. I always felt like something was watching me when I turned down dark hallways. The lights in my home flickered for no reason. And sometimes, when I looked in the mirror, I had the unsettling feeling that my reflection took half a second too long to move. Then someone knocked on my door. The sound echoed through my home like thunder. It was almost 3 in the morning. Who would be here at this hour? The air around me felt denser, heavy with a chill that didn't make sense inside my house. I didn't want to open it, but something told me that if I ignored it, the knocking would continue. Maybe it would never stop. With trembling hands, I turned the doorknob and slowly pulled the door open. Standing outside was a man with a vacant expression, sunken eyes, wearing a dark overcoat. My stomach twisted. I had seen this man before. On the stage. The night Phil disappeared. He held a crumpled envelope, which he extended toward me without a word. For a moment, I considered refusing it, closing the door in his face. But something in his gaze stopped me. I took the envelope, and before I could ask anything, he was already gone, vanished into the darkness of the street. My hands were sweaty as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single yellowed sheet of paper, a list of names. Names I didn't recognize, until my eyes reached the bottom of the page. The last name on the list was mine. Beneath it, a single word, scrawled in jagged handwriting, observed. From that moment on, nothing was the same. My research was followed by strange coincidences, silent calls in the middle of the night, figures in the corners of my vision, messages erased from my computer before I could read them, and then the sound. A distant noise, almost like the hiss Phil made that night, coming from places where there should be nothing, no matter where I was. I started to understand what was happening. Groundhog Day wasn't just a cultural tradition to attract tourists. It was a ritual. A ritual for something that was never meant to be seen, something that cannot be named, but that is still there, waiting. Maybe the groundhogs really were just a distraction, a way to keep people entertained with an innocent version of the story, while something much older, and much hungrier, lurks just beneath the surface. And now it knows that I know.